Hi, I'm Tim. Please join me in this video as I talk about the future of remote ID. Let's get to it. Remote ID is a new program put into effect by regulation rulemaking from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, that requires drones, radar control model airplane, any small unmanned aircraft to be able to be tracked. This is a means to understand where the drone took off, some information on its flight. This is part of safety and security, and the idea that you can track drone operations has a lot of very strong emotions from drone and RC pilots, usually against that. And what I want to do in this video is have a little bit further discussion about remote ID, where it came from, what the FAA does in this, how the FAA got tasked in this, to have a perhaps better understanding of the background of the remote ID ruling. It goes back years. And what is the future of remote ID? What are the next steps that's going to happen? As a reminder to new viewers, the remote ID ruling, the need to have the remote ID installed, does not come into effect until September 16th, 2023. This is being filmed in mid-July of 2023. And so we're still 2 months out from when remote ID is required. So we'll keep that in mind, and then let's go into a little bit of background on the various organizations, the FAA, the government, and how they came up with this remote ID ruling. Let's talk a little bit about the FAA, which is a pretty big government organization, and how it fits into the overall things that governments, in this case the US government, do. Governments, by and large, do big projects. They do large projects that are either too difficult, too expensive, too expansive for individuals or companies to do. Some examples of things that governments do are they built the Golden Gate Bridge from 1933 to 1937 in the height of the Depression. U.S. government provided the foundation, the financings for our victory in World War II. President Eisenhower in 1956 signed the act that began the construction of the interstate highway system. 1956 wasn't that long ago. That's when the first interstate was being built in the U.S. Governments also do things like put 12 Apollo astronauts on the surface of the moon. So governments do big projects as kind of part of what they do. The FAA is part of that concept of doing big things. And to have a little bit more detail of just how comprehensive the FAA is to our everyday life, let's take a look at the FAA by the numbers. It truly is amazing just how much traffic and things the FAA does. 45,000 daily flights handled by the FAA. A lot of passengers are flying each year, 5,400 aircraft in the air at peak times. They cover oceanic airspace when you cross the Atlantic or the Pacific for control functions. A lot of airspace over the United States, 520 airport traffic control towers, over 19,600 airports, public and private. You have the air route traffic control centers where the radar controls are, 14,000 controllers, and almost 3 million passengers fly every day in and out of U.S. airports. In short, there's a lot going on with the FAA. We can see that the FAA has a huge impact on our life as Americans. Even if you don't fly airlines or travel on the airlines, your life is affected by air travel, cargo. If you bought anything from Amazon Prime, airlines are just part of the fabric of this nation and how we can succeed and continue to grow and prosper. By and large, the way the FAA conducts its business is it writes regulations. It writes a lot of regulations. The regulations could be for pilots, they could be for air traffic controllers, they could be for flight attendants, mechanics, manufacturers like Boeing who actually build the aircraft. There's a lot of regulations, and the assumption on the FAA that is when they write regulations, they're going to be followed. So you'll see the dynamics that go along with the introduction of drones into the National Airspace System. There's a fairly sizable pilot population, the people flying the drones, that have minimal or no training in FAA regulations, may not even be aware of what a controlled tower is, yet they're flying their drones in the National Airspace System. And what do you do to accommodate these people with a safe and efficient air transport system? The mission of the FAA, and I'm going to read it to make sure I get it right, the mission of the FAA is to produce the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. So safety and efficiency. So let's talk about fatalities with U.S. airlines. Has the FAA succeeded in producing a safe airspace system? Again, this is being filmed in July of 2023. The last fatal air crash in the U.S. was Colgan Air in New York State in 2009, 14 years ago. Sadly, 49 people were killed in the crash, one person on the ground. And there has not been a fatal aircraft crash in the following 14 years. There was one fatality in 2018. There was a Southwest airliner flight. The engine basically exploded in air. It broke a window and a female passenger got partially sucked out of a window. She wound up dying of her injuries. That was another fatality. One accident in 14 years. You compare this to other forms of transportation. Each year in America, 46,000 people are killed in automobile accidents. So I would say from a safety viewpoint, as measured by loss of life, the FAA has done a very good job meeting their safety goals with having one of the world's safest air transportation systems. The subject of this video is remote ID and drones. So let's talk a little bit about drones. Where do they come from? How do they enter this picture into what the FAA is doing? Well, fixed-wing radio control models have been flown since the late 1950s, and the FAA never regulated it. There was no remote ID, nothing, because the radio control models, primarily fixed wings at the time, tended to operate in clubs. They kept the models within visual sight. If there was an airport anywhere nearby, they would talk to the airport to have an agreement. Basically, the RC models just didn't cause too much trouble with their flying. With the introduction of the past 15 years or so of practical, ready-to-fly, electric-powered drones, an individual can simply purchase a drone, charge it up that afternoon, be flying, and they can be taking pictures and doing various activities with a drone in locations away from a local club field that was just not necessarily done by any fixed-wing RC pilots back in the day. Drones have proven the utility. They're fun for the hobbyists for flying, but there's also incredible industrial and commercial activities for drone. Estimates are all over the charts, but they're expecting a $65 billion worldwide drone industry by 2025. That's a lot of drones. The problem is the drones are flying in the National Airspace System, and how do you integrate these drones with all the other traffic that's flying up there, airliners, Cessnas, paragliders, and so forth? What makes the drones harder is the existing aircraft are manned. There's a pilot on board. That means, from the FAA's viewpoint, manned aircraft can see and avoid other aircraft. It is a last-ditch effort to prevent an accident. They can see and avoid. The problem with drones is that they cannot see and avoid other aircraft. So for the drones to fly in the National Airspace System, it's going to take technology to enable that, technology that doesn't exist today. So the FAA has strategic plans. We'll talk about that in a second, about how to do that. At the beginning, 2015 or so, it's just complete separation, easy stuff to do like registration. The end goal is full integration of drones with other traffic flying in the National Airspace System. As I mentioned, this requires technology, and the first step on this technology path is remote ID. But commercial drone activity in the U.S. is forecast to be up to $29.8 billion by 2022. That's a lot of drones. In addition to that amount, there's a lot of activities that these commercial drones will be doing, to include agriculture, package delivery, energy management, media work, real estate, disaster response, law enforcement, and that's not even including the recreational drones. So the takeaway from these dollar figures and the growth industry of the drones are here to stay. I think I can be very safe in predicting that drones are not a passing fad. They're going to go away. We don't have to worry about it. So because they're here, it's growing, and they are absolutely have to be accounted for a safe air transport system. Something has to be done as they are integrated into the National Airspace System. One thing that is always, or should always be, a concern for recreational drone pilots is if there's some sort of incident where somebody gets hurt because of a drone operation operating where they shouldn't be. What will happen in that case is the public, Congress, news organizations get involved, and things start happening that may not be to the advantage of that community. I talked about the Colgan Air crash in 2009, 49 people killed in that very unfortunate crash. The New York congressional delegation was in full force. The families were absolutely furious, and they just demanded that something be done about that. Both pilots were fully qualified. There was a fatigue issue due to their commute. So regulations were passed on crew rest, which is fine. The other thing that passed, which we're still suffering the effects from today, was the FAA was instructed to raise the requirements for first officers to fly for a commercial airliner carrying passengers. Normally, there are two people in a cockpit, a captain and a first officer. The captain must have what they call an ATP license, an air transport pilot license. That requires 1,500 hours and a check ride to get that license. First officers, prior to the Colgan air crash, could have their commercial pilot's license as low as 250 hours, be hired, and they could learn on the job to get their 1,500 hours, upgrade to captain, and get their ATP at that time. The FAA mandated that both first officers and captains had to have an ATP to be hired by airliners. The ATP is a lot of money because you've got to have 1,500 flight hours, and it cut a lot of young aspiring pilots from applying for the airlines because they just didn't have the funding to get their ATP. So it's in everybody's interest to do what we can to follow rules and not have something bad happen that could cause an overreaction of the FAA or some other organization involved in that. So if we accept that drones are here to stay, what is the process to integrate these with the National Airspace System? There's any number of studies the FAA does. The one I'll show here is a UAS unmanned aircraft small integration strategy back in 2020. And you can see on the chart, they have the level of autonomy on the left, building the foundation on the bottom. The writing in dark blue is already done. When you start off with the lower left, that is low risk, isolated stuff, easy to do. At the upper right is full integration with other aircraft flying. If you look at the beginning, it was registration, Part 107 operations, the low altitude authorization notification capability, pilot program for integration, consistent airspace rule applicability. And then look right there at the top of the things already done was UAS flight restrictions and remote ID. That is dark now because the remote ID ruling is in place. Notice on the other side, to be done is a remote ID network, things like operations over people, cargo operations, urban air mobility. Those are the air taxis with 2, 3, or 4 people in an unmanned vehicle flying around. And then notice that there's an automated flight deck for transport. The goal of this is for companies like FedEx to take their aircraft and actually fly cargo without a pilot. That's a drone. It's an unmanned aircraft. FedEx is actually doing that now with pilot programs. There are companies that can put the required software in there. They have demonstrated automated flight with their Caravan aircraft with an end goal of full integration with other aircraft flying. Again, you can see that the remote ID is an absolute foundation of this vision for full integration. They've got to know who is flying to have this integration in the National Airspace System. Well, the FAA produced that nice integration chart showing what they wanted to do with drones, the remote ID, the full integration. What gives them, the FAA, the authority to do this? They're just a government organization. What if they are just doing this without any oversight or direction? That's where Congress comes in. So Congress has to give direction, authorization, and funding to government organizations, in this case the FAA, to do that. So as a reminder, what happened was Congress passed the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. The Reauthorization Act gave the FAA specific instructions on what to do with a range of things, from the strength of cockpit doors to training, to include remote ID. Let's take a quick look at the actual act of Congress and see what it says. There's a whole bunch of stuff on there. In Subtitle B of Unmanned Aircraft Systems, definition, FAA Comprehensive Plan, test ranges, on and on and on. And these are the marching orders for the FAA on what to do with remote ID, unmanned aircraft systems privacy policy, everything that's needed to do. This is the act of Congress. So this 2018 bill was $96.7 billion for funding over 5 years. The 5 years is up in 2023. They're working right now on the 2023 version of this authorization bill. And the language in there will have a direct impact on next steps for remote ID and other things that affect drone operations. The FAA bill is signed, the 2018 bill, so what happens next? Remember, for the pecking order in Washington, the FAA works for the Department of Transportation. The Secretary of the Department of Transportation is a cabinet-level secretary. It was Elaine Chao. Under when the 2018 bill was signed, she sits at the table with the president. The next step up is the president for this. So because the FAA falls under DOT, Department of Transportation will tell the FAA, read that bill, try to understand what Congress wants us to do a report, and I, the Department of Transportation, will brief Congress on what I think I have to do so there can be no doubt on what is going on with you, the FAA, doing your work. And so this is the actual report they gave to the appropriate Congressional Oversight Committee. So this is from the DOT to Congress. The 2018 Act, the FAA Act, devoted considerable attention to the FAA's continued work on integration of UAS into the National Airspace System. The points below highlight some of the agency's important work in this area, remote ID. To further the overall objective of integrating UAS in the National Airspace System, Congress recognized the importance of remote identification when it extended the Act. We talk about that because the 2018 Act started the process to write the final rule for remote ID. More recently, the 2018 Act provided the FAA with the authority to continue its work in this important issue. Notice the proposed rulemaking until we have the final rule right now. So then it continues on remote identification. This is important. Remote identification is fundamental to both safety and security of UAS operations. Remote identification will be necessary for routine beyond visual line of sight operations, operations over people, package deliveries, operations in congested areas, and the continued safe operation of all aircraft in shared airspace. It was that chart we showed you on integration. Remote ID will also be foundational for the advancement of automated passenger or cargo-carrying air transportation, which is often referred to as urban air mobility. With remote identification, the FAA and our national security and public safety partners will be better able to identify a UAS and its operator, listen to this, assess if the UAS is being operated in a clueless, careless, or criminal manner and take appropriate action if necessary. Remote identification is the FAA's highest priority UAS-related rulemaking effort that it goes on that they're writing the proposed draft ruling. So I think it's relatively safe to say that remote ID is an important part of drone activities, important part of FAA activities, and remote ID is not going away anytime soon. As all this was going on, drones continued to proliferate and just doing things that got the attention of a lot of people. There was a pretty important thing that happened in Gatwick Airport over the United Kingdom. It was December 19th through 21st of 2018. And what had happened, some drones were sighted close to the airport over that 3-day period. There were 140,000 passengers affected. 1,000 flights were affected by these drone operations. Nothing came out of it because the authorities couldn't figure out who was flying the drones, where they took off. They just couldn't get anything that would stand up in a court of law. But with that activity, a lot of people started wondering, well, geez, I wonder if drones are doing similar things elsewhere. And so what happened, there was a case study by a company called 911 Security that has what they call an air guard system that through some computer magic can track or have a pretty good idea of where certain manufactured drones are in the airspace. And they decided to do a test case in Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, Las Vegas, Nevada is a kind of unique situation. You've got the Las Vegas Strip there, millions of visitors, and a lot of businesses, casinos, and so forth that are interested in security. They want to make sure who's observing people going in and out of buildings, all manner of things. But McCarran Airport, I guess it's Harry Reid Airport now, the major airport going into Las Vegas, it's 2 miles from the Strip. So restricted airspace lies over the Strip as drone operators are flying in here doing their drone activities. But this is back, this test was done in 2018. No remote ID, nobody could tell where the drone operators are. And let's read about what happened from this investigations. So 911 Security deployed the system in late December of 2018 and just observed what was going on. They have a software platform that integrates drone collection data from Aeroscope and Apollo Shield with the capability of remote ID to track various brands and models of drones in real time through a single interface, whatever that means. The takeaway is smart people are looking at this and they'll come up with a lot of ways to track drones. That's just going to be the way going forward. Once AirGuard was installed, this is from the company, the system tracked and recorded an average of 50 drones a day within a 2-mile radius of the Las Vegas airport. The strip is located 1 nautical mile from the airport. Since it's inside the 5-mile no-fly zone, each of those flights violated federal regulations. Now, after collecting and recording the data, they layer the drone data over airport coordinates in 2-mile and 5-mile radius circles, which included airport flight landing patterns. Here is a picture of what that looks like, the circle around the strip. You can see the airport right there. And the results were shocking. 785 drones flew within 1 mile of the international airport in that 4-week period. No authorization, air traffic control didn't know it, they're just flying there. Upon analyzing the data further, looking at drone flight altitudes, they learned that nearly 300 drones flew over the allowed altitude of 400 feet. One drone flew over 2,100 feet. Here are some charts showing the airport drone data with flights within 5 miles of the airport, flights within 1 mile above 400 feet, FAA violations, and none reported to the FAA. And then we have a number of the drones with altitudes. See one up above 2,100 feet and many below 400 feet, but others in between. So that happened, and that's getting the attention of a lot of organizations that what do we do with this? And the remote ID is a foundational part of attacking this problem. So it begs the question, what's the way ahead with the remote ID? There's clearly a lot of stuff going on. Well, this is being filmed in mid-July 2023. We're about 2 months out from the September 16th date when remote ID is going to be required. And just as a review for the remote ID, they have a concept of FRIA. It's an FAA Recognized Identification Area. If approved, your local club airfield, you don't need any remote ID. Most, if not every drone being manufactured today, they had to be compliant by December 22nd, 2022, already is remote ID compliant. So there's literally thousands of drones purchased since December 22nd, 2022 that are remote ID compliant. And then there are remote ID modules. So I would grade the FAA's overall grade for rolling out this whole remote ID things as just a D. It's been horrible. We don't have a single FRIA approved yet. The remote ID modules are out there, but they're very expensive. I consider an acceptable remote ID module under $50, and but the manufacturers are pretty okay with their already compliant systems. So that's where we are. More comment on that at the end of the video. So what to do? So the FAA realizes that they have a compliance problem with drone pilots. Drone pilots don't need to go through any formal training activity to fly. If you want to fly your Cessna or be a commercial pilot or whatever, when you go through your training, you just have to follow regulations. The FAA assumes you're going to follow regulations. If you're in a flight training program and you say, I'm not going to follow regulations or those don't apply to me, the institution that's training you will simply not sign you off for a check ride. You will not be a pilot. With the drone operators, they're completely new to this environment. They may not like the FAA, they may not like what the government is doing in their opinion, and they're just not going to follow the regulations. The FAA knows this because industry estimates are there's about 7 million drones out there. However, the FAA has only registered a little bit under 1 million drones. So basically only 1 in 7 drone pilots are even bothering to register their drones, let alone follow the regulations. So my view is the FAA understands this. This remote ID is a work in progress. The remote ID is an incredibly complex system, in my opinion. There has been virtually no testing of these completed systems to see how they work in the real world. The range of many of these remote ID systems are less than 2 kilometers. I think when the September 16th date comes out, a lot of the remote ID equipped drones just aren't going to work, or there's going to be difficulties tracking them until they figure out how to get it right. This is common with avionics from the beginning, the very early radars, instrument landing systems, autopilots, anything. The first ones just didn't work. They figured out what was wrong, fixed it until they got a fairly operational model. I think that's what's going to happen with remote ID. We're not there yet, so I don't see too much, it's just my personal opinion, I don't see too much enforcement action from the FAA on recreational flyers for drones without remote ID, especially if you're far away from any busy terminal area. We'll have to wait and see. I do feel from all that I've read, and you can kind of get an indication what the FAA is thinking by what studies they fund. There's a lot of studies funding improved and advanced remote ID systems. I think there's going to be someday, not too far off, where the existing remote ID through some computer magic are going to be integrated into some sort of network that's going to track the drone flying. I actually think a tracking system while the drone is flying is going to be worthwhile. One of the huge concerns of remote ID with drone operators is that the average citizens with their smartphones can track a drone from the takeoff, figure out where it's landing, and maybe commit a crime, steal your equipment, whatever, where you land. With a network system, they don't have access to that. It's within the system, and that might provide some more security for the drone pilots. Also, in line with full integration, if there is a network system, air traffic control can have some idea of remote ID locations and capabilities. Right now, the remote ID is just takeoff, landing, some drone information. There is no air traffic control interface or knowledge of those remote ID activities. And a final note, this is just my opinion, worth exactly what you paid for it. I believe there's going to be a slip in the September 16th due date of remote ID. The FAA has done this before with the compliance date for the manufacturers to have remote ID compliant drones out of the factory. That was originally September 16th, 2022. There was no way the manufacturers, with all the paperwork and approvals needed, were going to meet that. What the FAA did was they didn't slip the date, but they put out a notice that the date had gone to December 16th. And what the FAA said was there's just simply going to be no enforcement action until after December 16th for the manufacturers to be remote ID compliant. I could see that with the implementation. They'll keep the September 16th date, just say there's going to be no enforcement until such and such a date to get an adequate number of FRIAs, remote ID modules, and drones out there. I don't know. That's just a thought on my part. I'd like to thank you for joining me in this video. Remote ID is an incredibly emotional topic for drone operators everywhere. I understand that. I get that. It's a huge program. I wish the FAA had done a better job with communications where they are. Communications, the minute you're late on something, like with the FRIAs, you just have to tell people what's going on. That has not been happening, so we're left guessing. Me doing videos like this to try to figure out the way ahead. But I do feel remote ID is here to stay. It is an absolute foundational part for the future integration of unmanned aircraft in the National Airspace System. And we'll have to wait to see how this develops. Thank you.